All right. Welcome, everybody. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Deniz. She is a trauma specialist and she treats people who are going through all sorts of issues related to trauma. But how are you today, Dr. Deniz?
Great. So happy to be here with you.
I'm happy to have you here because you share a lot of great stuff on Instagram, and anything from dysfunctional family stuff to learning how to not be a people pleaser, the fear of being seen, narcissistic families, so many things to jump into here.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
So your journey here, like what made you want to start giving back and helping people like this the way you do?
My journey with Instagram in particular, sharing some of this information on social media is something about it felt like there was just a gap in so much of the information when I first started my journey on social media. It's had some breaks here and there as I've become a mom, but just to see that there are these holes in the information that people are getting. And it's, of course, a tricky thing, especially when you're a trained clinician, because these little tidbits of information never encapsulate the nuance of something. But it also feels like such an opportunity to reach people that maybe don't have access to certain resources, aren't ready to engage in whether it's self-help or working with a clinician or a group. So just an opportunity to reach so many more people. And I think there's a difference between, when we recognize there's a difficulty or an issue in our life and we seek out help versus something that happens on social media is someone might send something to you or it appears on your Explore page and you watch it and you don't realize, oh, wow, that applies to me, without even being aware of it. So it just has these arms that extend so far out beyond being able to work one-on-one with folks in my practice.
I get you. And people who come to you, what kinds of things do people come to you specifically for? Or what kind of circumstances are they trying to heal or navigate through?
Yeah. So I see a range of difficulties and symptoms ranging from, just typical PTSD, where someone may have experienced kind of an isolated one-time traumatic event. But more commonly, I now see folks with complex trauma, where it's chronic, repeated, or prolonged traumas, typically starting in childhood, sometimes in adulthood, depending on the relationship. But usually it's childhood related. Usually it's very tied to their early attachment experiences. So we see a lot of nervous system dysregulation, a lot of behaviors that when you look at them on the surface can look really unhealthy or keeping people stuck. But when you actually understand their context, it's so much tied to how they learn to survive their earlier years. Mm-hmm. And the body has just kind of held on to those things for safety reasons. So, they're in their adulthood now, whether it's trying to excel in a career or build healthier relationships, have reciprocal relationships, manage family dynamics. All of that leads us inevitably to addressing a lot of the origins of these things.
What are some of the behaviors that might look unhealthy at first from someone who has PTSD or CPTSD?
Yeah. You mentioned the fear of being seen, and I think that one is super relatable for most of us in some way. But, those are very much, I'll describe some of the behaviors, but they're very much tied to what we might call the fawn response, which is more of our please and appease response, that people are just in the recent years coming to understand a lot more. But those are behaviors like people pleasing, being super agreeable, never feeling good enough, having this tendency to put other people before you and kind of neglect yourself, whether emotionally or physically, being very perfectionistic. I know that one, we get a lot of positive reinforcement in the world for sure.
Yeah.
Difficulty being vulnerable. I mean, all sorts of things that are don't just kind of stay siloed in you as an individual, but they extend into your relationships. But an inner critic, I think, is another one that most of us can relate to, a really harsh inner critic. On the surface, you're like, oh, this is causing so many problems. Your relationships aren't reciprocal. You don't know how to take care of yourself. You don't know how to speak up or say no. It's hard for you to make mistakes or try new things or put yourself out there. When you get to the core of how those things developed and where they were helpful at some point, what we generally see is that it was some version of an attempt at safety. And usually if you really needed it again for a prolonged or repeated time, those safety mechanisms tend to hang around a lot longer.
Right.
Almost like, the younger parts of us that develops these protective mechanisms don't quite know that you're an adult now and that you are safe.
Right.
So we really do have to look under the surface. But if anyone resonates with those things, even with the freeze response, like a lot of people think they're just struggling with laziness or procrastination, but it might actually be that your body's in a state of freeze. And we really need to look at what happened that your nervous system is so impacted.
I think that's a good one too to go over. I don't think people mention the freeze response as much, but would just like mindless social media scrolling, would that be kind of an example of a freeze, or is that just more of an avoidant, would you say? Like,
it can be both. The actual behavior, we can use it to avoid or to check out, but doom scrolling is a great example
doom
of
scrolling.
being
I love that word.
Phrase. Yeah.
There's no shortage of that in this day and age, the old doom scrolling. And everyone has their own version of the doom scrolling, right? Dudes will have their own version. Women can have their own version. There's political versions. There's all sorts. Yes. But back to the fawning and people pleasing, I think the big thing for me is just that it wasn't acceptable to like have your own thoughts. And it's not like these people pleasing responses and fawning responses are coming from nowhere. It's like, no, there's a reason why they were there. And it's because rightfully you are nervous to do these things because you were criticized and you were judged and you were shut out, or love was withheld from you, or you were punished in some way. And that conditioned you to, I'm going to people please. I'm going to try to do what they want, or else all these negative consequences are going to happen. Exactly. And like in adulthood, people bring that with them, right? And it can be now that used to keep you safe as a child, but now it's harming you. But, and even this is the other thing, when you're not a people pleaser, you will probably disappoint some people and you will make them upset sometimes. But that's the thing, being okay, even though that's happening.
Yes. Yeah. Two really important things that you just said, recognizing that it comes from somewhere, which sounds so obvious, but I think there was a time, and for some people, you still might look at yourself this way, where you chalk this up to this is your personality. And that is not the case, which I know can open up a whole other can of worms about like, well, what is my personality if this isn't it? Which is part of our healing journey. But these things are not necessarily, we can have more easygoing temperaments versus different temperaments, but being a people pleaser, someone who continuously puts others' needs above their own, is absolutely something that is learned to keep you safe. And the idea that in adulthood, we hang on to this, our bodies don't always recognize that we're no longer in those circumstances. It's almost like the nervous system gets stuck, switched on in that state of hypervigilance, or all the social mood monitoring that we do, especially when we're fawning. And again, there are aspects of this that I think people can get praised for, especially women, I will say, because the gender roles around being agreeable and flexible and smiling and that sort of thing. But it can come at such a high price, not just your relationships and how you feel about yourself, but your physical health too. Gabor Mate wrote a whole book on this called When the Body Says No. And so if you're someone who identifies with this, I definitely recommend you take a look at that, because it's just so fascinating. We're understanding so much more about how interconnected our emotional and our physical health is. I think we just used to act like we're cut off from the neck down, but the system is interconnected. If you are people pleasing, for example, or abandoning yourself out of that fear that something bad is going to happen, your body is not making a conscious choice. It's like a reflex. right? When it's been learned like that. And reflexively, you push down your emotions, you push down your needs, but they don't just disappear. And that's what most of us think is like, I just brushed past it. And sure, when something's like not super important to us, or it's not that big of a deal, like in reality, we can sort of just move past something. But when we repeatedly do that, we're essentially shoving down all this really powerful energy into the body, and it has to go somewhere. But it can wreak havoc on our muscles, our immune system, chronic pain issues, fatigue, all these things. So these patterns extend just beyond your relationships and your emotional health. They also have a really profound effect on your physical well-being.
Right. I think you mentioned that on an Instagram post the other day, and I think I had mentioned I wouldn't be surprised if there's autoimmune disorders, cancers, and other sorts of, or gut issues too. That's another big one, right? All of those contribute to people that are not letting it out. Like, you got to feel it to heal it.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes that's the incentive for people to do this work, because they're like, the emotional stuff, it's like soft, it's, even woo-woo. But when you actually understand how it impacts your physical health, we're so much more likely to seek support or go to see a doctor or talk to someone or read something when it concerns our physical health versus our emotional health. But these things you absolutely cannot separate.
Sure. And I think even the another layer of the people pleasing that I think it took me the longest time to see, because at first you think, okay, I'm putting other people's needs first, I'm trying to make them happy. But then eventually, like, another layer of it was for me, and I think maybe if you see this too, but it's a way to get my needs met too in the present. It's like, they're going to like me, or they're going to think this, or like and this is especially true for the people that in a dating circumstance, they'll get with someone that like they feel they need to save, or they feel like, I need to rescue this person. It's like, well, what is it doing for you? Feeling the need to rescue. What is it doing for you to be the one that's going to be the savior? It's probably doing something. So like, it looks like the behaviors of just someone who's people pleasing, or like being a caretaker kind of thing. And I like that word caretaker now more than codependent.
Yes.
Codependents come out of favor these days, because originally it was supposed to be about the codependent on an alcoholic or an addict kind of thing. But I think caretaking says the same thing, except more efficiently. But that second layer, but could you speak to that second layer there, where we're getting like our needs met in another way from doing that fawn response?
I mean, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is just to reframe that fawn response. It's keeping you safe, but what you're actually doing in so many ways, you're regulating the perceived unsafe person. Right? So if you're agreeable, you're not making waves, you're keeping the peace, that person stays regulated. And as a byproduct, you stay safe. So it's like you're keeping yourself feeling safe and regulated, but you're doing that by keeping someone else regulated. And often if you've had to do that in childhood, if you're very parentified, you're taking on a lot of emotional or physical responsibilities that an adult should. You do often fall into that caretaking role. And then when that goes unchecked, we just tend to repeat our patterns in our relationships later on. But the other part of that comes to mind is also about what we get through that process, but related to conditional love. Right? It's like, if with a parent in particular, I was high achieving, or I was just like the easy kid, I didn't cause trouble, I cleaned my room, I got good grades, then my parent would give me more love and attention or approval. And I think that's what can also happen in our relationships, is we're not consciously doing this, but we might be overgiving or working so hard to be thoughtful for someone, or bend over backwards to do something. And it's not just out of the kindness of our heart, but it's also because that's how you learned somewhere that that's what gives you love and affection.
Right.
And that is a hard question to ask, I will say, because, when you're healing from people pleasing, I think the first place people tend to look is like, all the people in my life that are taking advantage of me, or, don't listen to my boundaries, this and that. But we do have to ask the question is, what do I get from that? And it's not a blaming question, but it's just understanding how the dynamic is much more complicated than that. And it can feel very anxiety provoking when people start to let go of some of these patterns, because one, your body alarm might be going like, this is unsafe, like, abort, go do the thing that you used to do. But also the fear that I may not get my needs met if I'm not operating.
And I love the fact that you just said that the responsibility portion, or asking that question, it's not blame. And this is why you don't say this to someone right away, right? They're coming out of a not so good situation. Like, you don't instantly hit them with, why are you doing that? What are you getting out of this? It's like, but no, down the line is a pertinent question to ask down the line. The timing of this stuff, I think, is super important. You also mentioned parentification there too. And I wanted to ask you a couple things. Yeah. One, how do you normally see a lot of the people that have CPTSD? What did the parentification look like in their family dynamic growing up?
Yeah. The majority, I would say, is around emotional issues and emotional dynamics in the family, with a few small exceptions, which certainly exist out in the world, where a parent, maybe they had mental health issues, they had medical issues, or a sibling had medical issues, or a parent was working multiple jobs to keep things functioning and going. So a kid may have taken on both emotional and physical responsibilities, maybe caretaking siblings, making meals, being left at school a little longer than usual, those kinds of things. But more often what I see is a dynamic where there's blurred boundaries between parent and child, where the child either can become the confidant for the parent, they're exposed to adult conflict and adult discussions, pulled into those things, triangulated in that way, or the parent uses them to regulate in some way emotionally. They can't do it within themselves.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a really, really big one. And that tends to be more often the case the more we head towards parents who struggle with emotional immaturity or narcissism, because of the blurred boundaries, the lack of individuation, the enmeshment that happens. So that's where it tends to be a little bit more common, but absolutely the other is very real and valid as well.
Right. And there's actually, like, the people who have a lot of anxiety and who worry a lot as parents, they might be less narcissistic, but they still do that. They still try to control their kids because they want to regulate themselves on the inside. So they do it through control. And there's like the narcissistic way to do that. And then there's the words fall out of favor, but the more neurotic kind of anxiety ridden way. But they both end up doing the same thing. Right? They think, I got to control this person, so I'm okay. And whether you call that emotional immaturity or narcissistic, or maybe there's an addiction involved, or maybe a combination of all of that, right?
Yes. Yeah. The unresolved trauma that trickles through the families can certainly just show up as straight up anxiety, which makes so much sense. What I see often is like the parent, when they were a child, if they were unprotected in some way, they become such an overprotective parent, trying to shield their child from what they experienced. So the anxiety can show up in that way. But, that can manifest in so many different ways. It can manifest in control. It can manifest in being too hands-off, even in your parenting, trying to overcorrect for some of those.
Right.
But with the parentification, one thing that I do see really commonly is it's very tied to self-abandonment and people-pleasing, because you learn to kind of forego your own needs in service of everyone else. And there's 100% cultural layers to this as well, which is important to mention. But a lot of hyper-independence too, because you get praised for doing things on your own and really just not having needs. And that's really hard to break when you're adult and you've gotten praise for that. You felt safe when you were doing those things. And then suddenly you show up trying to have like this very connected adult relationship, and it's like all out of whack, completely imbalanced, or you may not even know, at the core, you may not know yourself, let alone who you are, what your interests are, what you want to eat for dinner.
Right.
So sometimes I think we don't even realize that these are things that we struggle with or have developed until we're face to face in those later romantic relationships, because it's our next most intimate relationship where all of those things start to show themselves.
Yeah. I mean, and people, they lose touch. I think they lose touch with their feelings, where that they don't even know, like they don't even know that they're disconnected. They don't even know that they're not in touch with their genuine thoughts and feelings. So they're just kind of go, go, go. And I think one of the things to go over with that is just overall in life right now, like in our country, it's tough. Like there's the undercurrent of just having to deal with financial issues, having to deal with just living life and paying bills. All of that stuff is an undercurrent that influences all of it. So it's really difficult to talk about these things in a silo because now these stressors, and I'm sure you see it with a lot of your clients, they're impacting them, right? They're impacting them. That makes everything a little bit harder. And the stress builds up and it becomes difficult.
It does. I mean, we don't live in a society and a structure that supports being slow and going inward.
No.
Trauma is just one thing that can disconnect you from yourself and your experience. But absolutely, all these daily stressors, financial stressors, socio-political stressors can pull you out of your experience, because you're, if you're living in a state of stress, that's where the focus is. Focus becomes survival. Our focus goes outward to what needs to be done. I think one of the key differences for folks who maybe had a dysfunctional upbringing or some early attachment wounds is you never had the chance to be connected to yourself. Right? When these things start so early, you don't get that mirroring, right? Because that's what one of a parent's jobs is early on, is to mirror back to the child who they are, their self-worth, by showing interest in them, having curiosity in them. But if very early on your job is to just be there for the parent, to be the peacekeeper, to regulate them, to be their confidant, to help take care of siblings, whatever it might be, you're immediately disconnected from your inner experience. So this creates all sorts of complications to be disconnected from yourself. The one that I see the most is difficulty trusting yourself, whether that's in your relationships or like, what's the next life choice that I'm making? Like, can I decipher what's the difference between my anxiety and my intuition? When someone's crossing a boundary, does that even register in me? Or do bypass all of that information? And most of us do, because we haven't been taught to slow down and tune in, or we've been taught to dismiss what's there. So for people who deal with these things, it's so much a journey of reconnecting to yourself, emotionally, physically, in terms of sensation, and really like discovering who has been there all along. Because as we said, like, that's not who you are. Being a people pleaser is not who you are. It's how you learn to stay safe.
I think, and you mentioned a great thing there, where for a lot of people, especially if they've been abused, whether it's from a family circumstance or a romantic circumstance, they don't even know. Like, they don't know what they're experiencing is disrespect. They don't know that they're being invalidated or abused emotionally or whatever other kind of abuse you can think of. Like, it doesn't even register as that. So like, when you don't register it properly as you're being disrespected, you're being invalidated, you're being abused, then you just kind of go forward as if that's not the case. Yeah. But I think and that's one of the best things, like you do and I do on Instagram, is when you talk about some of the behaviors that people are struggling with, that people are doing to them, that really helps them to put it into perspective. Oh, this is disrespect. Oh, my partner who was being toxic, that's what they did. And so at least getting them to see that is a huge first step.
Yeah. I would actually say more of us know those things are disrespectful, but we've been invalidated so much around them, or been fed the narrative that it's just normal and that we just need to accept it, that what we are disconnecting from is less the like logical idea of it and more the felt experience of that. So imagine this, right? If you're a child And every time you express a certain emotion, it's dismissed, shamed, punished. You're just going to, every time that emotion comes up from there on out, if this is a pattern, you're just going to push it down and not deal with it, because what you're being told is this is not real, it's not valid, your reality doesn't matter. So on some level, our bodies know what disrespect or abuse are, but we have had to disconnect from that information that registers so physiologically. Certainly there's cases where, I think behaviors have been so normalized that we're like, oh, I didn't realize that that's actually a thing. But again, I would still challenge you to say, if you reconnect with your body's going to tell you you didn't like that, even if logically you thought maybe that's normal. That normalization is what disconnects us from that.
I like that way of putting it. So you're saying that to reconnect with what your body already knows, as opposed to maybe learning for the first time, right? So no, like your body knows this disrespect. This is not quite right. You're just disconnected from like your experience and your feelings.
Yeah.
Okay, I could see that.
And think about this: little kids come into the world, so connected to themselves. Like they cry when they're hungry, they're cold, they want milk, they want to go to sleep. We're so in tune with our body cues. We almost get conditioned out of that connection.
Okay. That's a good way to put it. I haven't heard it put that way often, but I like that. What is some of the experiences that you see people, like what are the big pain points that push them in? What is their emotional landscape, or what are their thoughts like when they first come through your door?
Yeah. Usually there's been some stuckness somewhere, whether it's relationship, a career thing that they're trying to pursue, but like dealing with that imposter syndrome or fear of being seen. They're dealing with strain or stress in the family dynamic. There's been a conflict. So there's almost always something. Often people who come to see me, I'm not the first therapist they've seen, to be honest. Many, unfortunately, come to me saying everyone that I've worked with didn't have an understanding of some of these family dynamics, or they didn't see it, and then I was blamed because how this person presented things if it was a family therapy situation. So often it's not their first run at therapy, so there is some skill and awareness of the process coming in, but it's often their first time actually getting to deal with some of the dysfunctional dynamics head on.
Okay. And so do you see, I guess, a lot of narcissistic parents or borderline parents or just emotionally immature parents, and that kind of like trickles down?
Yeah, I would say more so in that spectrum of emotionally immature to narcissistic. You of course can have CPTSD from other experiences and experiences that have nothing to do with your parents, right? Childhood abuse doesn't have to be from your parents. And it can also be neglect. It can be from grandparents. You can have been abused by all sorts of people in your life. So I want to just throw that on people's radar as well. But in my practice in particular, it tends to be people coming in with attachment issues. And on top of that, they might also have had single event traumas.
Oh, so double whammy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I would bet you probably see more like fearful or insecure attachment people come through the door than avoidance, if I had to guess.
Yeah. So avoidant attachment is part of the insecure attachment. So we have secure, and then in insecure, we have anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. And there's some subtypes in there that make it feel really complicated, but those are the main categories. I would say I tend to see more anxious attachment and sometimes disorganized when there's been a tremendous amount of trauma.
And they say disorganized would be one more associated with the borderline, I would say, or like the push-pull dynamic.
Yeah, it does tend to be more correlated with that, but there's also a lot of overlap between CPTSD symptoms and borderline symptoms. And we know now, of course,
absolutely,
it's just a trauma disorder. But that push-pull dynamic, for folks who aren't familiar with it, the idea of how that forms is essentially, your caregiver is supposed to be your safe person, your safe base. So when you get afraid, scared, need protection, your instinct is to run to that person. But if that person is also the source of the fear, terror, or abuse, your protective system pulls you away. So it creates this disorganized behavior where there's a push and pull, primarily if your caregiver was the perpetrator of your abuse.
Of course, of course. And I think overall, like the conflict resolution and problem solving, collaboration, that thing right there is something that very few people, even into adulthood, can seem to do well with, where just disagreements or trying to get to the bottom of something, because everyone can be okay in the good times for the most part, right? But put in a conflict, put in a disagreement, put in telling someone no, and then all of a sudden, all that stuff comes to the surface, whatever it was, right? Yes. So what are your recommendations for people in that kind of case? Or do you see a lot of common, just like overall dysfunctional families where there's what I would call dishonest harmony as opposed to honest conflict, and they'll sweep things under the rug, things like that?
Yeah, I love that phrase because it is, I think, something so many people can relate to, where it's like, but they're family, or, just like keep the peace, and, don't send waves through the family, all these messages that we get. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's like, it's peaceful until someone has a big opinion about something. Someone doesn't go along with the norms of the family. Someone wants to do something different, or someone says no to someone else in the family. And then you see the dysfunction come out. It's like, oh, the system's breaking down here. Okay. Somebody's trying to disrupt the status quo, and the system mobilizes to try to maintain the status quo. And unfortunately, that's where people get really harmed, is when they try to step outside that. And we see that most commonly with people who might identify with that scapegoat role, which is the role where you're blamed and you kind of carry the weight of the family's dysfunction. People used to call it more the identified patient. But in my eyes, what I see personally and professionally is the scapegoat is really the one who is like, this is dysfunctional. I see the truth of this. I'm not going along with this. But they really are the truth tellers or the truth seekers. And they speak up and they push back. And it does absolutely create problems in a family that wants to ignore and pretend like everything's fine.
Right. And a lot of it's image, right? It's the image oriented, where they want to show a persona to the world, this facade. Oh, we have the perfect family. Things are this. And so they present one way in public, but then behind closed doors, who knows what's going on behind closed doors? And there's many different degrees of toxicity behind closed doors. And it doesn't even have to be a full-blown personality disorder either of a parent. There can just be emotional immaturity is enough to do a lot of this, because, I mean, let's face it, overall, I would say there's probably more emotionally immature people than there are mature people, period. Yeah. Which is why so many people can, I think, relate to the dysfunctional family stuff, because so much of who we are, that's where it's coming from. It's coming from like our two caregivers, like the parents that we have, the people we grew up with in the family. We didn't choose them. Yeah. We didn't choose their temperament. We didn't choose their emotional regulation, or if they have a personality disorder or addiction. But here they are. They're raising us, and they're doing hopefully the best they can, but not always, right? But like starts so much.
It does. That's where we learn all these things, right? Like you, not just from a modeling perspective, but literally, like as a child, your parent's nervous system gets mapped onto your nervous system as a kid, because your nervous system is just not developed enough. And we essentially borrow from our parent, and for better, for worse, it tends to be our mother who's our primary caretaker. So mom's nervous system, how regulated or dysregulated she is, has a really significant impact on the growing architecture of the brain and how the nervous system functions. But I think you're right. It's like more of us have experienced this than the idea of emotional maturity. Like when I talk to clients about that, they're like, that exists? Like people really, like parents really can apologize or like have a conversation after an argument that like resolves something. I'm like, it exists. It's a lot more rare than I think we would like to think, but it exists and it can happen. But we see a whole generation now in therapy talking about these issues, hopefully so that we have all these cycle breakers trying to do things differently. And I don't say that lightly, because I know previous generations absolutely come in with their own experience of very significant or valid trauma.
Sure.
And we have to remember that that is not a free pass to just keep doing what you're doing, right?
I would agree.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's helped me too in my own healing. It's like, yeah, I try to see it as like my grandparents. They treated my parents not the best, and they had their own invalidation and mistreatment, etc. And not that it excuses any of the things that like I experienced myself, but it does help me put it in perspective a little bit. And I'm like, okay, like they didn't know what they didn't know. It doesn't excuse their behavior or anything, doesn't make everything okay, but it just kind of helped me put it in perspective a little bit. And that's not something I would tell people immediately either. It's like, no, like you need to be validated and encouraged in the beginning and supported. And then as time goes on, I think that's more of like a stage 3 healing concept where you let go of resentment, and I don't like pushing people to forgive either. If someone wants to forgive, they can. Yeah. But like, I think letting go of resentment, I don't try to push people to do that either, but I do find it has its benefits. And that's one of the ways that I've learned to try to let go of resentment.
I think most folks, whether you consider yourself a trauma survivor or just someone who grew up in a dysfunctional family, more often than not, this is a big misconception, with all the people, especially on social media, saying you're blaming parents and you're breaking up families. More often than not, the adult children who are doing this healing are overly compassionate to their parents, right? Too forgiving, too understanding at the cost of their own experience. So exactly what you said, like more of our first step is like providing a lot of validation. And that is part of what drops you into your body to trust your feelings and allow them to be there. And then you start to see, sadness, anger, resentment, which is healthy to feel, not to get stuck there, right. But healthy to feel and to move through and process. Also, because feeling those things allows you to take appropriate action if you need to set boundaries or protect yourself in some way. If we don't feel those things, we just keep going the way that we've been going.
That was a game changer for me, learning that too. There was a book on boundaries by Townsend and someone else. But they said, whenever there's an anger that you feel, it's a sign that some sort of boundary is needed, or you got to speak up about something. And you also reminded me of one of the biggest straw men that I hear about no contact. People are like, oh, you're saying no contact. You're telling people to run away at the first sign of disagreement or conflict. Yeah. It's like, no, that's not what we are saying, for the very reason that you just said. It's actually people have been too tolerant, too accepting, too forgiving, and finally at their wits' end, that's when maybe they'll do that. Yeah. It's not like people are jumping to that immediately. It's like, no, if anything, it's been the opposite. They've tried and tried and tried and have driven themselves crazy trying, and they're just not getting heard. So, and if their boundaries aren't getting respected, what are you going to do? They're not giving you much choice.
Yeah. That's the emotional immaturity coming through right there, right? Is someone's trying to hold you accountable, and the only way to get that accountability off of you is to make you look like, oh, you're just being petty, like I screw up once and you're cutting me off. People who have to even consider no contact, it is one of the hardest decisions people make. It's never something that someone takes lightly. Like nobody wants to be disconnected from their family at their core, because that's just biologically how we're hardwired, to be connected to our family, to be connected to other human beings. When people make that decision, it's literally like a final act of self-preservation. Nothing else has worked, nothing. And it's been years in the making, but that is the part that is so unseen by whether it's somebody who's really emotionally immature or narcissistic or just really toxic or unhealthy in some way, is they can't acknowledge that there's been years of these conversations, years of someone trying to get, a different perspective or to be seen. And that is sometimes where that education for the person trying to heal is so important. I said this on another podcast episode. It is a weird thing as a psychologist to say, we need to recognize this person's not going to change, because I'm in the business of people changing and growing and improving and hope around that. But when it comes to some of these very entrenched personalities, especially if someone truly has a personality disorder, it becomes more harmful for us to maintain that hope. Not because we're like, oh, there's no chance like you're ever gonna, do something positive or be kind, but because if I hold out hope that you're finally going to be the person I need you to be, I'm going to keep getting hurt. I'm going to keep dismissing my feelings. And that's going to cause all those emotional and physical health issues. And I'm going to essentially put my life on hold, waiting for an acknowledgement that's likely to never come. And then I'm how many years into my life, and I haven't actually lived my life because my life has been about trying to get this person to see me. So that's a really hard line to walk with someone, and somebody has to be ready to see and hear and accept those things. And just as you're saying, right, these aren't things we throw at people, right, when they're starting to do this work, especially because you always want to make sure that what we're talking about are patterns of behavior. And that's what I always try to put in my nuance on Instagram for the people that come after me with the, like, someone just screwed up once. Like, no, we're talking about prolonged patterns of behavior, especially patterns that happen not just in the family, right? Like you see these things, people blowing up all sorts of relationships around them. It doesn't always just stay isolated to the family. It can, where that's the only place behind closed doors the dysfunction happens. But the more severe someone is on that spectrum, they're going to make a mess out of other things in their life too.
Wow, you're making me think of so many things here. So one, this is one of my sayings, that no one hates no contact more than a narcissistic parent who claims they have no idea what they did. It's like, and I see that, and this leads right into whether they're narcissistic or not. It's the emotional immaturity piece where it's like, if you were to really take a look at the situation now, and granted, and there is a difference between no contact and, say, the silent treatment and alienation and someone, or abandonment. They're two different things. But if you truly look at a scenario where someone is going no contact, it's like, well, if you're honest with yourself and have some humility, there's probably going to be something in there that you can see. Okay, this is why they did that. And I ignored them or invalidated them or refused to respect their boundaries. There's going to be something in there. But I think whether it's narcissism or emotional immaturity, that's what gets in the way. And I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the ways that just emotional immaturity shows up in people's lives?
I think one of the most hurtful aspects that's common to both of those things is the lack of empathy. Because that's kind of the springboard for many of the other difficulties and issues, especially around taking responsibility or accountability. And again, this gets more severe as you go towards narcissism and the full-blown personality disorder. But it is so difficult for some of these folks to take the perspective of someone else. It's almost like we're asking them to do something that they just don't have the capacity to do. Like, you go to the 11th floor, that's where I am, come meet me there. But your elevator only goes to the 9th floor. And I'm like, come on, just get up here. Some of these folks cannot take perspective. There are absolutely some that can, right? The more we're in emotional immaturity, there's more possibility of that capacity. Takes time to nurture and develop that. But if you can't take someone else's perspective, you don't feel empathy towards them, you can't put yourself in their shoes and go, I wonder how that thing I said made them feel. Or when they're telling me they're hurt, that doesn't mean that they're attacking me. It means that they're like expressing something for, more connection or to have a resolution or a more positive outcome. That's just like not even there. And so much of that is part of the defense mechanisms that get developed for those folks, that the defense mechanisms around feeling shame prevent someone from being able to introspect and go within. Because especially for a narcissist, and I'll speak more specifically to this since this is where more of my expertise is, for a narcissist, the experience of shame is so intolerable, because that's truly what they feel inside at their core, is a lot of self-hate, self-loathing, a lot of fragility. And that's why there's this false self that gets projected outward on this grandiose self often. So anything that remotely touches the experience of shame is what is going to elicit all those big reactions, because to take accountability would, for them, just gets equated with being drenched in the experience of shame.
Right. I mean, it's the hypersensitivity to criticism part. And because they have like fragile sense of self-worth, like they'll act superior, grandiose, but that is very fragile. And anything that doesn't mimic that or mirror that back to them, they really go on the attack whenever that happens. And I think, and this is a good thing to go over too, just the ways in which the conflict turns toxic. And what I see is people giving people the least charitable interpretation of what they do and say, twisting and distorting what they say, misinterpreting what they say, trying to win and be right, as opposed to kind of work together with you and collaborate. Those are the big things I see. And then what's at the bottom of that? Not being able to admit they're wrong, not being able to take a step back and respond rather than react, not having humility. But those are like the core things they can't do, which causes all of the rest of those things to present themselves. And I would love to say, oh yes, people, even just emotionally immature people, can learn to do those things. But you do got to see those actions in the people, right? If they're not doing it with their actions, I can't tell people, oh yeah, they're going to be able to do it. Just keep on holding out hope. It's like, no, you got to believe what their actions are going to tell you. And if they're not treating you well, they're kind of they're telling you what you got to do. Like, you can't expect people to change. And I think that's another thing to go over too.
Yeah.
Just when trying to help somebody, like when to stop, when to give up, when to wave the white flag in some of these cases.
Yeah. This is a super individual process. And I think most people, what I see they have to go through is a process where they're like recognizing what's happening. They start to name some things, even if it's just like on a behavioral level about what's unhealthy or harmful to them. They might then start to feel empowered to speak up and start to try to set some boundaries. And that sometimes can work depending on who you're dealing with. And that sometimes can completely flare up the situation and make it worse. And again, that's especially with somebody who's narcissistic, because explicitly telling them your boundaries can cause a lot more harm, actually. So depending on how all that fleshes out, then we might start talking about, what does like skillful disengagement look like? What does gray rocking? What do your internal boundaries look like versus I'm explicitly telling this person what it is that, making a request for something to be different, or telling them what I'm going to do differently if they don't change their behavior. So I think so many people almost have to go through that to experience what works and what doesn't. From my perspective, when we're talking about like just relationships in general, leave out emotional immaturity, narcissism, we always want to start in kind of like the least aggressive way, right? Like we want to start with a request, give someone a chance to hear what our needs are and see if they can meet them. Right? That's what we do in healthy relationships. In unhealthy relationships, that request is totally disregarded. It's invalidated. It's dismissed. And then in a narcissistic dynamic, that boundary or that request is taken advantage of because you've just basically revealed your most vulnerable spots to them, right? The things that hurt you the most. And that's why we eventually tend to go towards more of the internal boundaries if someone's going to maintain contact with this person.
Okay, because that's what I was going to ask next is, how does communicating boundaries with a narcissist, how can that be harmful?
Yeah. Right. So they know where your vulnerable spots are. You're going to likely get those typical behaviors that we see. You're going to get a rage response. You're going to get guilt and manipulation, victim blaming, the silent treatment. And I think the really common one that certainly gets captured by emotional immaturity a lot is like, well, I'm just the worst. Right? I'm the worst partner. I'm the worst
victim.
Mother, father. Yes, which falls into the victimization. So it's like it never goes anywhere. And then somehow it ends up getting all twisted on you. So this is how it plays out. You might express something. They're going to have a very poor reaction because of that shame that's getting touched on. they're going to maybe be explosive or completely ice you out. You're going to naturally have a reaction to that as a human being. And then all focus gets put on your reaction, and we're completely away from the first issue that we were trying to address to begin with. And when you're a kid in this scenario, what happens is the idea of your parent raging at you or completely icing you out is so painful or scary that you completely put all of that to the side. The thing that I was asking for, forget about it. The thing that I was trying to express, forget about it. Just love me. And that parent who struggles in that way might continue to punish the child for having an opinion, expressing something, telling them they were hurt by something. So people learn very early on, if this is a family dynamic, that these are just conversations that are off limits.
Right. And that's how they're conditioned to find a romantic partner just like that in adulthood. If that's their dynamic growing up, that's the conditioning. That's what they're taught. Oh, this is what love looks like because I'm trying to attach to my caregiver and I have to earn their love. If I'm not careful, they're going to withhold love. And then when they see someone doing those very things in adulthood, well, they go right back. And it's like I always hear my friend Meredith Miller said, if home wasn't a safe place for you, be very careful with people who feel like home.
Yes.
It's like, yes, it's like that. And that's true until you've done the work. Once you've done the work, then safe can truly be safe. But until you've done the work, no, be careful. Be careful with the people who feel like what you are used to.
Yes. Yeah. Something that comes up in my practice quite a bit for folks who are in the dating process, healing from these things, is that shifting out of those familiar dynamics to someone who's actually safe and trustworthy. Their nervous system tags that as like a really boring person.
That's a good one to go over too.
Yes, because your body, emotionally and physiologically, you're used to the highs and the lows of somebody who's very toxic like that. And that's part of what keeps people in a trauma bond. But when you finally are stepping away from that, it's like your nervous system hasn't quite recalibrated to what safety feels like, that it really can feel boring. You're missing the excitement of the toxicity.
Now, how do you get people to work through that? And I didn't go over this with you yet, but when you treat people for trauma, what are the methods that you do?
It really depends on a number of factors, what someone's coming in with in terms of what their experience is, their current symptoms, their goals. So we might start in a number of places, but I'll speak generally. When we're healing from complex trauma, our treatment tends to be very integrative. It's not focused on just one thing. Education is always the first step, so that not only people understand what they've experienced, but that's also such a jumping off point to develop more compassion for yourself. And that is such a hallmark of being a trauma survivor, is lacking compassion for yourself. So that education starts to open the door for that as you start to understand why you do certain things or how something came to be for you. And then slowly, depending on someone's capacity, we are actually starting to move them into contact with their body, contact with their experience, so that you can start to reconnect to what it is that you're feeling in the here and now, and what the younger parts of you have kept away from you. So for that portion of work, it's often a lot of mindfulness-based work or somatic work, anything that helps someone feel safely in their body. For some folks, they have to do a lot more emotion regulation work, because being in your body can feel so unsafe when you've been out of it for a while. And then the way that I tend to lean in my work is more inner child and parts work, that is really connected to attachment experiences.
Okay.
But basically, you're working with all of the younger parts of you that carry these wounds and carry the pain of these wounds, working to develop a relationship with those parts so they can actually express what wasn't able to be expressed at the time, what's being stored in the body. And that work, you're really using your body as a doorway in to do that. But it's not just about reconnecting with pain. It's also, that's where we reconnect with all these beautiful parts of who we are. as children, part of our authenticity. And I think that's, I love that that's a word that's become such a thing these days, is I'm trying to be my authentic self. But it is so much more, I don't know, that feels a little light. But when you actually think about what it is at its core, is people are trying to reconnect to who they were before they were conditioned to survive. And through that process of feeling and reconnecting, that's where people start to develop more of an ability to set boundaries, to express boundaries, because you have to know what feels like a yes or a no to you in order to do that and to speak up. And then really last phase of therapy for me, I'm with you. Forgiveness is not a part of my work unless someone wants it to be.
Right.
What we focus more on is acceptance. That you let go through letting be. Letting be is the acceptance process, right? Allowing your feelings to be as they are, allowing the event to be as it was. And that is what opens space for us to really start living a more values-based life, where life is no longer focused on survival and safety and coming from a place of fear, but like, what do I want to build in my life, right? Like, what's important to me? What gives me fulfillment? So lots of different modalities that get integrated through there.
And I think a big one would be, what are the signs of someone that is emotionally safe versus feeling emotionally unsafe? Like, what are the symptoms of that, so people can maybe check it? Okay, this is what emotional dysregulation or unsafety feels like versus emotional safety. Yeah.
I would say, firstly, check in with your body. And I know that can be tricky for someone who's been, some of these unsafe behaviors have been really normalized. But again, your body is still going to tell you what feels good and not good if you can listen to that. But generally, when we're thinking about emotional safety, we're thinking about someone who takes an interest and a curiosity in us, right? Where it's not just about them. When you speak, they're listening, not to respond, but to understand. And they do or say things that show understanding, right? You feel seen or cared for in your communication. It's reciprocal, right? There's a back and forth between the two of you, and that there's trust. And that part of it is something that I want to reiterate, the time component, because we can feel, especially when we're like replaying these old patterns, we can feel really connected to someone really fast. And that's where we want to pump the brakes. We want to give someone the chance to show us over time that they are trustworthy. So that's tied with emotional safety, because you want to share a tidbit of something and see how someone responds. If that feels okay, if you feel like you got what you needed, they responded in an empathic, warm way, whatever it might be, that tells you, okay, it's safe to share a little bit more of myself with this person. But if we just like speed on through that process, we might miss all those opportunities to kind of pick up on some of those cues.
Sure. I mean, and taking it slow. That's a big one, because a lot of the toxic individuals out there, they thrive on the rushing, getting you to make a impulsive decision. And then, like, the hormones and whatever else, the love bombing, that's just how they roll. And that's how a lot of those relationships begin. And I've heard stories of people getting married within a month or two, moving in within a month or two. And it's like, you don't even know this person and you're already moving in. It's like, and not to say that's their fault, but it's like, well, what can you expect in a circumstance? Like, you don't really know somebody until you've been through all 4 seasons with them, until you've seen them through many different kinds of interactions and circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, with this kind of abuse in a relationship like that, it's slow and insidious. It doesn't just, like, the switch doesn't flip overnight. Sometimes there are cases where that happens, but usually it's a slow chipping away at someone's sense of reality or trust in their perception or their self-worth. So if you've jumped right into that relationship, that person's really still got their mask on.
Yeah. The frog in the boiling pot is what that is all about, right? Yeah. And that's true, because, and that's what people will, like, they'll criticize the people like, oh, what'd you stay for? What? And it's like, well, it didn't start that way. Like, it happened slowly over time. And then before you know it, you're in the boiling water and boiling waters, what, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental, verbal, spiritual, financial, all of that, right? And then you're kind of in that trauma bond and it's a bad place. But it certainly doesn't happen overnight in most cases.
Yeah. You just said something important too, which is, when something didn't start that way, and I think this also applies to parent-child relationships, no parent is all bad all the time. No person, unless we're talking about like a really psychopathic serial killer, right? And even then, they can be quite charming. But that plays a lot of tricks on us because our minds know what to do with a bad person or someone who's continuously displaying harmful behaviors constantly. But when it alternates between someone being seemingly kind or warm or attentive and the abuse, not only is that incredibly confusing for us, it makes us question and self-gaslight, but it also is part of what helps us or hinders us in a way that we hold on to that hope, right? We're like, we could get back to that place. And the clients that I've navigated breakups or divorces from these kinds of partners with, there is constantly that conversation of, but I remember the time when we were like this, and I feel like we could just get back there if they just did this, right? Or if they were just willing to. And same thing with a parent. It's like, we of course have positive memories with that person. But what our minds do is we often, use that to negate some of the difficult or negative parts of the relationship. Because
it's just like the gambler, right? The gambler that's trying to get to their intermittent rewards. Yes. I'm just one big spin away. Yes. And they're going to be like this. And that's like I say, if you catch yourself defend, excuse, explaining, or rationalizing away their behaviors, or wishing they were who they used to be, or wishing they would become someone else, that's a problem. Like if you don't like who your partner is in the present, that's a problem. And a lot of people, they're in that spot where they don't really like who their partner is, but they wish back then or in the future. Yeah. But I know you got to run here, but I definitely appreciate you coming on the show, Dr. Deniz. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram or TikTok at Dr. Deniz Saidi. I post pretty frequently during the week. Reels there, and I also have a 6-month program. If you're interested in working with me and you're not located in California, that program is open to you. And I'm getting ready to launch a masterclass on February 16th called Unmasking Dysfunction, which is going to go into a lot of what we talked about today, that you can sign up for at link in my bio there.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, Dr. Deniz. You shared a lot of great stuff.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. You have a good one.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Hopefully I didn't keep